So, welcome to our tutorial, just reviewing the ideas around cell transport and specifically the concept of active transport. So, whenever it comes to cell transport, there are three processes that you need to be familiar with. Diffusion, osmosis, and active transport. These are all means by which substances are moved around organisms, in and out of cells, dependent on what the substance is and the surrounding conditions. So, key thing to remember about these two, because I'm just going to remind you briefly of these and focus on active transport during this tutorial, is that diffusion is the movement of particles from an area of high concentration to low concentration. You have high concentration to low concentration. So that's our key definition of diffusion, just to remind you of that. Now, osmosis, you might like to describe as almost a variation of diffusion, in that it is the movement of particles of water, and it is only water, from high to low concentration through a partially permeable membrane. Through a partially permeable membrane. Now, a couple of key ideas just to highlight in this. Often, you see this description of movement being described as down a concentration gradient. Now, all that refers to is the fact that you have particles moving where there are a lot to where there are fewer. And that difference in number between where there are a lot to fewer is what we call the concentration gradient. So, and as well, you often see the term concentration gradient there. When we're talking about the term concentration, all we're referring to is the number of particles in a specific area. So if there's a high concentration, there are more particles in a specific area. Whereas if there's a low concentration, there are less particles. Now, it gives you a little bit more context for diffusion and osmosis there. There's the other term as well, just to bear that in mind, is partially permeable membrane. So all we're referring to there is an outer surface that has got holes in it that only let certain sized molecules and atoms through. If they're too large, they can't fit through. Whereas if they're the right size, they will fit through. Okay, so we've got this idea of partially permeable membrane, concentration gradient, diffusion, and osmosis. Now, how does active transport figure into this? Now, active transport, if you want a definition for it, is the movement of particles from low to high concentration using energy. Using energy. So key thing to bear in mind is that it is the opposite to diffusion, because it requires energy and it's going from areas of low concentration to areas of high concentration. It's also worth remembering that diffusion and osmosis are referred to as passive, which means they don't require energy to occur. That movement of particles from high to low concentration is a naturally occurring process. Now, two examples of where active transport can occur within biological organisms are in root hair cells and the small intestines. Root hair cells and small intestines. Now, root hair cells are long, thin projections that stick out of roots that increase the surface area of a root and have very thin walls. Now, what that means is that substances don't have very far to travel. They don't have very far to travel, and that there are lots of surfaces across which they can move. Now, root hair cells carry out active transport on mineral ions that are found in low concentrations in soil. So ions of things like magnesium, nitrates, and potassium. They're found in low concentrations in soil, and they are absorbed by active transport into root hair cells. So these root hair cells, you would say, large surface area, so that there's lots of surfaces for these substances to move into the roots across, and also they have very thin walls, so that it's a very short distance for these substances to move. Now, obviously, where it goes from low to high, it requires energy. So this energy that's needed comes from subcellular structures that we call mitochondria that we find in animal and plant cells that are the site of respiration. So the absorption of mineral ions into root hair cells that project off of roots in plants is a good example of active transport, because these mineral ions, things like nitrates, are used and needed to make molecules such as protein that plant to grow. Now, the other example in the human body is the villi, the small intestines. Now, these are almost finger-like projections that run along the edge of small intestine walls. Now, as the small intestines As the small intestines are part of the digestive system has broken down food into these smaller molecules that it needs. So things like glucose. I'm just going to draw a few little G's here as examples of glucose molecules that have been broken down from sugary foods, carbohydrates that you've absorbed, been digested. Now, these sugary molecules, glucose molecules, want to be absorbed into bloodstream. But sometimes we can have particularly high concentrations of glucose in our blood. Because the blood obviously carries the glucose around the body to the cells for respiration. Now, we've got high concentration. Now, the only way for the glucose to get from the villi of the small intestines out into the bloodstream is by active transport. So low concentrations. So the glucose move by active transport. So this is useful because it means that basically the body can always have access to glucose, even if it's got higher quantities than it currently needs, because it will always need access to more. So we've got these couple of examples of active transport and what it is. Now, to take it even more in depth, we can think actually how do the molecules of mineral ions or glucose and other such substances, how do they get from outside the cells to inside the cells? Now, there's a sort of three-step process that's worth us looking at to show how simply they cross the membrane. How do these molecules cross the membrane into cells from low to a high concentration? So if we just go through this, so we've got our cell membrane that covers our cells. If you draw out the following, like so. So this is our cell membrane. Now, so we've got this particle that wants to move across the membrane. It has to move through what we call a protein carrier molecule. So low concentration outside the cell, and it wants to move to where there is a high concentration. So it has to move through this protein carrier molecule. So the molecule itself binds to this protein carrier molecule. So it's the first step in the process of crossing the membrane during active transport. Particle binds to the protein carrier molecule. Okay, step one. Step two. Once it's bound, protein carrier molecule then uses energy to change shape. And during that changing of shape, it moves the molecule from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell. So it moves it from the outside to the inside where there is a high concentration of particles. So that's our second step. So energy changes, protein carrier shape, and it moves particle across the membrane. It then finally reverts to its original shape so that it can repeat the process again if needed. And this is how active transport moves substances from a low concentration across the membrane to a high concentration. So, third step, active transport has moved the particle from low to high concentration. And there are three main steps of how active transport occurs across a membrane, moving substances from an area of a low concentration to an area of high concentration using energy. So, thank you for watching our tutorial.